Hey folks, welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a look at how you can amp up your inks by including texture and really giving your composition some form and some depth. So in this example that you see in front of you, this is just something that I quickly sketched up. I typically sketch in red. I'm going to convert it to black by hitting Command U. I'll just drag the lightness all the way down. So I've got this thing looking pretty dark. So there's nothing wrong with this composition, but it just feels a little bit flat. So let's go ahead and add some texture elements into this composition. But before we do that, let's think about where the light is coming from here. We've got this, I can assume this to be the sun or the moon. I'm going to treat it as the sun. And as the sun shines towards us, all these areas that are not directly visible by the sun are going to be covered in shadow. So I'm making a new layer here. And what I'll just simply do is I'll indicate the areas that I don't want to have much, if any, light. So on this tree, for example, those areas of the tree that are not receiving light are going to be filled in with dark values. So I can use my magic wand tool and I can fill those areas in. And what I'm hoping that you'll see is that it dramatically just makes that tree pop from the rest of the composition. This is known as black fills. So typically when I'm looking at a composition, I first of all want to know if the light is explicit. In other words, is there a light in the scene or is the light off stage or if it's off camera? So, and if the light is off the camera, you have to now kind of decide where you want the light to be. All right, so let's continue along here. These areas that are, you're going to see some light kind of bleed over the top of this tree. And you might see some light kind of peering in here. Light doesn't, this for a rounded structure, light kind of bends around the structure. So I'll just fill those areas in with black. Now this is just black fills. We're going to come back and we're going to add some texturing information later, but just by looking at the way we're adding these dark values, it is making some significant contrast, even for these bushes over here. We can see that that adds some dark values, and maybe even for some of these leaves. And so the way I like to think of this is, what are the parts, if you're looking at a light, the parts that are not directly hit by the light are going to be darker. Now, I don't want to make everything super dark because then I won't be able to see anything, right? But this just gives you an idea of where I'm going with this. The next thing I want to do is I want to think about how I can infer the form of some of these objects. For example, if I look at these rocks here, yeah, they read like rocks, but they are just lines. They're not really conveying any kind of form information. So I'm just going to indicate some contours. You know, the rock is kind of a rounded structure, and I can throw in some dots to give it a sense of material or texture. And then the parts of the rock that are not going to be directly visible, if I don't want this to be as dark, for example, what I can do is I can use hatching. So I'm just going to simply hatch. Hatching is basically creating a series of repeating lines. And what this does is this creates a value of something that is darker than the rocks that are surrounding it, but it's not as dark. So this is one way where you can use inks to convey different types of value. For this bush right here, I'll make that dark. I'll just carry this on. And I'm shading along the contour of the object. Now this rock that's in the immediate foreground here, I'll just fill that in with black. But I want to be able to see some of that rock, so instead I'll just add a section where the light is kind of peeking through. This area over here is where the light is peeking through. And now I've got some dark values and I'll add some textures to that rock. Now, something else that you can also do with this technique is if you use the lasso tool, you can actually carve out and create certain areas that appear to where the light seems to kind of bleed through. And it's also giving the rock a sense of form, right? We don't want this thing to look flat. We want it to appear to be dimensional. Um, you can go overboard and create a lot of texture to where the drawing looks really busy. So what's helpful is adding those black fills and then adding some of the textural work. So we've got some of these ingredients already placed in. Let's think about the fact that the objects that are closest to the viewer, we're going to see more detail. So in this particular case, this is going to be a wooden fence post. So I'll just go ahead and draw some curved lines to give this the indication that it's actually something that is wooden, right? Now I don't want to fill it in completely with black because I want the sign to be visible. And I want to make sure that, you can read the texture of that particular material. I can also add some little splints here. That's a form of texturing to kind of give this a feel that it's actually made out of wood. You can throw a few little dots. Can never go wrong with the dots. All right, now let's take a look at the grass. Before I do that, I'll just fill this rock in. You want to make sure that you close all your gaps. There you go. Let's look at the grass here. So the grass looks pretty flat. The areas that are behind this brick wall, we're going to see it's not going to be fully dark, but we are going to come back in and we're going to make this area of the grass darker by putting thicker lines in closer proximity to each other. And as we start to get away, like the area that's going to be the darkest behind this particular wall is going to be really dark. But then as we start to move away, we can start to see that more light seems to be coming through. So what we've done here is we've created this value gradient from something that's really dark to something that appears to be lighter. And that's another thing too. Like as you start to see light directly, you might have a few bits of grass here and there, but like this section here where it's behind the wall, you might have darker values that are using a thicker line weight. And I'm simply repeating that pattern like so. So inking is not just going over the outlines of an existing drawing. Inking is a beautiful art that allows you to really express a wide range of values just using black and white. For this rock right here. And texture information is important too, so it doesn't create any kind of confusion when the viewer is looking at a particular piece of art. You're not going to be there to explain what something is when you're not in the room and someone's looking at your work or someone sees your work online. It should be very, very clear, right? So I've added some light little sprinkles of grass here because I want folks to know that this is a grassy area, but the grass is actually going to be darker here. And this is something I talked about in some of my coloring videos too. You don't want to wait until you add color to make something look good. I think that the challenge here is how do you make something look exciting or interesting with just black and white? If you can do that, then when you add color carefully, you can really create a really nice piece. Uh, Same thing for this tree over here. I'm going to come back in and layer some repeating curves. And you can see how that gives that tree more form. Same thing over here with these leaves. And then the trees that are in the background here. I want some of that light to come through. There we go. And this is a hilltop. It's not super obvious, but if I throw in a few little specks, people are going to read that as grass. And as we get further away, from the elements that are within the composition, like the grass on this hill back here, you're not really going to see too much detail. And the sun here might cast some shadows on some of our trees as well. Typically, cast shadows are going to be facing away from the light source. So this just gives this scene a little bit more pop. I'm not really messing with the shadows too much on some of these outer areas, but that is something that I would go back and do. So you can see now this is starting to look a lot more developed. Same thing for these trees here. We might see some grain on some of these trees. And as we start to move those lines closer together, we're giving the illusion that the part of the tree that's on the right is going to be darker. We can fill this in with black. And even for the canopy of this evergreen tree here, we can come back in and make these areas darker because it is not receiving any light. We can do the same thing with this tree. Some trees have this nice linear type of striation. Some of them have more, chips like bark, right? We've also got our mountains here too. The mountains look a little bit flat, but what we can do is we can add some lines to indicate overlap. Maybe this is like a snowy mountain cap. See, that kind of information is lost unless you go back and add it in. And then for this brick wall here, you don't have to draw every single brick, just because it'll make it just too busy and it'll attract a lot more attention to that specific area. But what you can do is you can draw a few representative bricks. Bricks are usually stacked in a manner where you have, they're not just directly one on top of the other. Usually for support, they're usually stacked like this. It'll just kind of create a little bit more variety. And then you may want to come back in with some hatching. Now you could say, well, what about this side? Shouldn't it be completely in black? Well, you have to take some artistic liberty with this. I can use some additional cross hatching in this area to kind of make it appear to be darker, or that is something that I can selectively include when I'm actually adding some color into this particular scene. So I'm throwing my little favorite dots here. I'm adding some lines here to show the ridges of this torn brick wall. Come back in with these bushes, add a few repeating curved shapes, and you can start to see that this is really taking form. This is what we're working on, and this is what it looks like without it. You can definitely see the huge difference. And we haven't added any color into this composition yet at all. Even for this bush back here, the parts that are going to receive the light are going to be the white areas here. And then as we start to move in, just creating this repeating pattern gives us some depth. Now, what about this big giant rock here? That's, if I fill that in with black, then we start to lose some of the bushes. So what I may have to do is I may have to come back in with the lasso tool like we just did before and just create a hint of some of the leaves that are in this bush. So I'm just making a curved shape and I'm using the Command X tool to cut. And now if I fill this area in with black, you can see that there's some evidence. You can see that there's some foliage there, whereas before you couldn't. So that's something else that you can also do. You can subtract from your black fills. So maybe here on this rock, I might indicate a few striations by holding down the shift key with the lasso tool and just cutting these areas. And what this is also doing from a compositional standpoint, it is actually creating a set of leading lines that are moving the viewer to this particular area of the composition too. So look at this. It's like now we've got something that looks like stone. It appears to have some form to it. It looks interesting, and we now have some depth within this composition. Now, the last thing here is, well, is this a road or is this a stream? It's kind of hard to tell without actually adding some textural information. I'm feeling like I want to do something that's going to make this look like a stream. Initially, when I drew this, the idea was to create it as if I was creating a road, but I want to challenge myself and actually make this into a stream. Uh, and what I'll do here is I'll just create a set of thicker lines using a thicker brush. And what these lines are doing are they're basically conveying the idea of water. You know, water kind of shimmers. There are certain parts that are receiving light, but because this water is also moving, now we have this clear understanding that we're dealing with water. And as we start to move over here, we might see some other lines that suggest water. It's still a little bit ambiguous. I guess an argument can be made, well, that could be like a path on a road too. But again, what we can do is we can carve out, we can add some other information. Let me just go ahead and just do that here. I'll carve out this area here and have the water kind of flowing around this particular rock. So the idea here is I want to make the drawing as visually clear as possible. And so now I've got this rock that's there. I'll go ahead and add some shading to it just to give it some extra form. For this tree trunk here, we might see some textural information there. Behind the tree, it's going to be darker because that area is not receiving as much light. And there you go. Now you have a scene that looks like it's a daytime scene, and we've indicated our shadows, maybe for this tree. I'll fill that area in with black. Here I'm just coming back in with some thicker lines to make this side a little bit darker because this part of the tree trunk is not directly receiving light. And now we've got a composition that we can continue to expand upon. So, you know, your inking is not just creating the outlines. You want to think about how to convey material and texture as well as lighting information through your ink. So here's the before and here's the after. So let me know if you found this video to be helpful. What's the one tip that you learned from this video that you really feel like it makes a big difference? Drop me a line in the comments below. If you have any questions about anything that I've done, or if you have any topics for future videos, please let me know about that as well. It's a little bit of a long video, but I think it's kind of important. So let me know what you think. Thanks so much. See you soon.